There are a lot of details to sort through in the 1,000-page reconciliation bill passed by the House after several late-night sessions. This recess week will give agencies and analysts a chance to study the specifics before the Senate takes up the bill next week. Here with initial insights is the Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government, Lauren Duggan. Lauren, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, it's Memorial Day recess. So, did they finish their homework in time to go on vacation?
On the House side, they definitely did. They had set this Memorial Day target for passing the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and they got it done and left town right afterwards Thursday morning and won't be back until, I guess, next week in early June to start doing more things. But they checked that big thing off their to-do list and are going to be looking forward to what happens next on that, just as we all are.
Well, they did have to pull a couple of all-nighters to get it finished.
They did a late Sunday night, an overnight in the Rules Committee, and then an overnight on the House floor. So some very tired people who I assume slept a lot over the weekend.
Well, let's talk about the reconciliation bill. We've talked a lot about the federal benefits angle, but several things are different from what was initially proposed to what was passed. Talk me through that and maybe what surprised you most about what was left in.
Well, we saw a lot of changes made after the Budget Committee worked, first initial set, but then there were all these last-minute negotiations to win support for the bill. And some of the outcomes of that, maybe the contours we weren't sure of, but we knew there would have to be a deal on the state and local SALT deduction to get that through. We knew there had to be some changes to Medicaid to win over some of the conservative hardliners who wanted those things to kick in earlier. So we saw that they got to those negotiations and got there. You've mentioned the federal benefits things. FERS, the changes there had dropped out, and then some of the other provisions changed there. But there are still some changes that I'm sure your listeners in particular, or anyone who's in the federal retirement system, will be keeping an eye on, including this at-will employment provision that's still there. So, a lot of those things have survived for now, but the House is only one side of the story here, and we'll be watching those provisions clearly as they go over to the Senate.
Yeah, the idea that you can pay more into your federal retirement to retain your at-will status seems a little convoluted. And then the other thing that I think is interesting is that you now have, if the bill passes in its current form, that you'll have to pay a fee to file a claim with MSPB.
Yeah, that is like a fundraiser thing that was in there to try and raise income. So, yeah, that is one of those provisions that we'll see if that survives. This bill does use fees as offsets in a lot of different areas, whether you're filing immigration paperwork or some other, federal processes. They would charge you a fee as part of that. And that's one of the reasons I think it also gets into this reconciliation bill, which is supposed to be about the budget, is, increasing revenue, reducing spending, that sort of thing. So we'll be watching those provisions, of which there are a lot. I mean, this is 1,000-plus page bill at this point. 11 different committees had their say, and everything from taxes to spending to fees to what have you. So, we've read the bill, clearly. We've had a lot of analysis put out, but their details here are going to matter, too, once they start negotiating between the chambers.
Well, is there anything in the bill that gives us an indication of future spending, especially in the cases where there are agencies where the Trump administration has sort of disestablished them or programs that they've cut back? Any indications here about what the future for those programs might look like?
Some of this is, I think, putting into motion things that they've tried to do administratively. There's some changes to how the CFPB is funded in here. They've had this funding stream from the Fed, and they're trying to affect some of that in the legislation, and then we'll see what happens later on there. That's always been outside of appropriations, so this is probably their best chance to do that. But certainly, the reduction in government that they're wanting, there's some early signs of that here in a lot of areas, but there's funding for more things. There's clearly funding for DHS, clearly funding for DOD in here, and the president's budget request that came out on May 2nd incorporated some of that spending in their total budgetary outlook. So I think those two things go together there. But there's also funding for the Kennedy Center, which the president is clearly very much involved with now. There's funding for security for the World Cup and the Olympics, and also for some of the bicentennial celebrations next year. So there are spending elements of here that you might not think would be in this bill, given the top line numbers and top line programs. So we'll see how those play out over time. But definitely this is part of the broader spending outlook for sure.
The Senate is sending some early messages here. What are they saying?
Well, there's 53 members there on the Republican side, and they need to keep at least 50 of them on board with this, and J.D. Vance can break a tie. But Ron Johnson has been out there. He's still kind of litigating the one bill or many option, which everyone else seems to have coalesced on the one big beautiful bill. But, the Medicaid changes that were in here, I think we'll get a close look. They focused on things like work requirements rather than cutting the FMAP reimbursement rates or things like that. So we'll see how that's received in the Senate. And then some of these provisions may have support, but may not have the procedural requirements to stay in the bill under the Byrd rule, which we'll start hearing a lot about, which could knock things out if they're not budgetary in nature. So the Senate will make its imprint on this. John Thune has said that he expects his members to do that. And given every vote's importance, an individual senator has a lot of sway in this process. And we'll be looking to that as it moves over there in the coming weeks.
I'm speaking with Lauren Duggan, the Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Well, the Senate has set itself another holiday deadline, July 4th, right? So
Yeah, and that's a tight one. Once this bill hits the floor, unlike other bills that tend to go on for weeks, it will be a truncated process with a vote-a-rama where they'll vote on a lot of amendments at the end. But yeah, that's an ambitious deadline. I'm sure they'll be working behind closed doors to nail that down and running those procedural traps that they need to run. But July 4th is right around the corner, and then they might have a few steps left. But hanging at the end of this is the debt limit discussion and how long can the government borrow, because the debt limit is part of this debate. The House agreed to a $4 trillion increase as part of their plan, and the Senate may go higher, or we'll see, but that's going to be a closely watched number as part of this too, and also a driver probably of the end of this process, given that they don't want to default going into the recess, most likely.
Well, and then next up in the House are the actual 2026 spending bills, because the beginning of FY26 is not that far away either. How is that process getting underway?
They released their calendar for the subcommittee and full committee hearings, or markups, and they want to be done with that by the end of July. So that's a pretty ambitious timetable for rolling those out. We'll see what that means in terms of floor votes, but at least they will lay down their marker of this is the House Republican vision on spending. May hew closely to the president's request in some places. I'd expect departures in others, though, because there are programs that people will continue to support, even if they were zeroed out in the plan. But I think it sets up tough negotiations with the Senate, where Democrats have a say, because those bills do need 60 votes to get over the line. So Democrats do have some pull. They do try to hew to a more bipartisan approach, but that's still going to be a collision course, probably as we get closer to September 30th, on what to do, even on a short-term deal, and then who knows about a longer-term deal.
Right. Unlikely to start the fiscal year with an actual budget document, more likely a continuing resolution again.
I almost think that's a certainty, just given the late start and that the full budget hasn't yet reached Capitol Hill, because we've only got the skinny plan, which is light on detail, and appropriators need those details.
When are they expecting the full budget?
We're trying to figure that out. They're hoping to get that soon, because the appropriators would need that to do their work. So,
well, let's change topics a little bit, because GAO released a pretty interesting finding. Their first, that the Trump administration actually violated the Impoundment Act. This relates specifically to the Department of Transportation, withholding payments under the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. How's that being received up on the Hill, and what do you think the portent is for it?
I think it's, like you say, it's the first of several decisions that GAO might be making on these actions around funds. The Democrats on the Appropriations Committee, like Patty Murray, said it shows that the president was blocking the law in her mind. And the administration, however, is going to push back on that. They've said GAO's opinion is wrong, that what DOT was doing here was appropriate under their authority. But it does fit into this larger debate about presidential power on spending, the Impoundment Control Act, which was put in place when congressional Democrats at the time were pushing back against President Richard Nixon, and is part of this larger debate. We are still waiting for what we've talked about in the past, the rescissions package that would cancel some funding. That's something the Impoundment Control Act set up to try to put procedures on this. But I do think this is another development in this inter-branch fight over what Congress passes into law and how the president executes it. So this is yet another development there that's worth watching. Well,
in fact, GAO says if DOT had submitted rescissions under the law and followed that process, that would be entirely different than unilaterally withholding the funds. So it'll be really interesting to see if the budget package comes up with those kinds of rescissions and how that all gets rolled into the budget process and discussions over the summer. I think GAO has 37 more investigations on Impoundment Act violations that it's conducting. So that'll keep us occupied for a while.
Absolutely.
Well, Lauren, thanks so much for joining me today. There's no shortage of things to talk about.